Hey, how's it going today, everyone? So today I wanted to talk about Project Resistance, the new Resident Evil game that Capcom has been alluding to these past couple of weeks. The best part about this is that there's actually some screenshots for this new project, and while there's a lot of speculation as to what this title actually is, the common thing that's been going around is that it's actually Resident Evil Outbreak. And I do have something to share about that towards the end of the video, but for now, let's just kind of go along with the video the way that I wrote this script. So just for some context, for those of you that don't know what Resident Evil Outbreak is, the spin-off series or Outbreak series is literally just set within the Resident Evil 2 and 3 timeline with the focus on some civilians of Raccoon City with specific attributes. At its core, it's a co-op-centric survival horror game, but it could be played offline with some very subpar AI, at least based off of my experience when playing File 1. I've never played File 2. I would like to try it out, but again, never played File 2. I've only played File 1, so that's just based off of my experience. And it was one of the first goes at Resident Evil being played online for the franchise. What made this game stand out, aside from the online aspects of it, was the fact that you had chapters, you had several characters with specific set skills that could be able to pick locks, craft better medical supplies. They were able to make makeshift weapons similar to the Dead Rising franchise before that was even a thing. And on top of that, you were limited to inventory space more so than the mainline franchise at the time. And you were also on a timer, so if you were completely infected with the T-virus or if the timer ran out, you pretty much died and became a zombie. And that was probably one of the coolest aspects of the Resident Evil Outbreak series, was that you could become a zombie in this sub-series of Resident Evil games. Unfortunately, despite the Outbreak games being more or less ahead of their time as far as online goes, for Resident Evil, they didn't really do so well since online for the PS2 really wasn't that common. However, these days, online is a huge component to gaming, and generally speaking, co-op or multiplayer games do have dedicated player bases if the game is made well and is fun to play. So that being said, do I think Project Resistance is a new Outbreak game? Yes, I do. And the reason being is that there is a web domain that has been renewed for Resident Evil Outbreak. I will get more into that towards the end of the video, like I said, but that is something that is really great for anybody that is looking forward to a new Outbreak or has been wanting a new Resident Evil Outbreak for quite some time. So to elaborate on what I think that this new Outbreak, I'm not sure if it's going to be a File 3 like what some people might hope, for a couple of reasons. I think that in terms of the original Outbreak series, I'm not so sure if they were canon or not to the actual lore of Resident Evil. I don't really follow too much on that side of the lore, since that's more of a, I would say, gray area for me, because I'm not too invested with that sub-series of Resident Evil games. However, if they were canon, a Resident Evil Outbreak remake would actually make more sense as opposed to doing a File 3, because they can make that line up better with the Resident Evil 2 remake and also line up better for the inevitable Resident Evil 3 remake. So another reason why I don't particularly think that this is going to have anything to do with Resident Evil 3 remake is just because I think that in terms of Resident Evil 3 remake, it's just not ready for development yet. While Resident Evil 3 remake would be really cool to see right after the Resident Evil 2 remake, the problem with that is that Resident Evil 3, the original at least, was a much bigger game by comparison. There was just a lot more areas to go through, so in terms of development, that might take much longer to make, which means we'll have to possibly wait until next gen to get that particular remake. However, there is a bit of a silver lining to this in that Resident Evil 3 Remake would have the benefit of being able to reuse assets from both Resident Evil 2 Remake and this potential Resident Evil Outbreak Remake, because chances are you're going to be going through a good portion of the same locations found in both games, so there really wouldn't be a need to remake this whole game from the ground up in the case of like Resident Evil 2 Remake and also Resident Evil Outbreak Remake. Essentially, the less work they have to do for Resident Evil 3 Remake means that the sooner it can come out. And then there's also the biggest reason why I think this is a remake and not a File 3, and this is mostly because of the fact that we have Capcom's RE engine. They have an emphasis on focusing on photorealism and photogrammetry with games like Resident Evil 7, Resident Evil 2 Remake, and Devil May Cry 5. All of the characters had real-life models scanned into the game to assume the look of the characters featured within those games. Now, this can be a double-edged sword because, as we've seen in the case of both Resident Evil 7 and Resident Evil 2 Remake, any character with the last name Redfield was getting altered to the point where they were just completely redesigned. As far as I'm aware, there wasn't any given reason in the case of Claire, but in the case of Chris, the excuse by Koshi Nakanishi was that more or less nobody in the real world looked like Chris Redfield from 5 and 6, even though you could probably easily disprove that with the amount of cosplayers that actually look like both Chris and Claire. However, I digress. The only reason why I brought this up is because the 4 screenshots that we have are a look at 4 playable characters that may have been redesigned characters for better or for worse depending on how you look at that. So for starters, the male character that has been prominent in most of these screenshots, wearing the white and red varsity jacket with the word raccoon on it, could possibly be Kevin, David, or George from the original Outbreak, completely redesigned. Initially, when I saw these images in the morning, I was thinking that this is probably either going to be Kevin or David. However, when I thought about it some more, I thought that it's probably more likely David or George rather than Kevin. To get into the reasons why I think it might be Kevin, or why I thought it might have been Kevin, is wearing the dog tag on his neck. That could be just a cosmetic there, or it could actually have some significance as far as like character background stories and stuff like that are concerned. I do think that as far as small changes along with characters' age and occupation is something that will be likely as far as this potential remake for Resident Evil Outbreak is concerned. Kevin in the original Outbreak was a Raccoon City police officer, so imagine in a potential remake where he's now a detective instead, and that would probably explain why he has more casual wear as opposed to the typical RPD uniform. The dog tag around his neck could also imply that prior to being a detective, he could have also possibly served in the military at one point. The reason why I'm starting to think that's not really the case is because if you think about it, David and George would probably line up better with this character design. In the case of David, he's a handyman in the original game who is formerly a delinquent and was really into Japanese history and culture. This could potentially be a new rendition of him where he's a college student who happens to major in history and just so happens to be really good or has a knack for being a craftsman. That could be a bit of a stretch though in that case. And then that leaves us with George, and I think this one is actually probably the most likely case because George in the original was a surgeon and he was able to craft specific medical items and healing items and stuff like that within Resident Evil Outbreak. So to change him from a surgeon to a college student who happens to be a med student, and given the fact that Umbrella particularly kind of owns Raccoon City, it would kind of make sense for him to be practicing to become a surgeon as a med student, and that could possibly tie into some events with Umbrella trying to recruit him because they would probably want to recruit young med students at the city's university. That's, again, a bit of a stretch, but I think that between the 3 characters, he seems the most likely to me, in my opinion. Anyway, to move on to some other characters, the girl with the blonde hair could potentially be one of two characters, Cindy or Alyssa. And right off the bat, I've noticed a lot of people have mentioned that could probably be Alyssa, only because of the short hair. And Alyssa originally was a reporter with a lockpick and a stun gun. However, just like the previous character where the actual character design could give you an impression of who that character could be, this character, in my opinion, could be a complete redesign of Cindy. Cindy, while being this nice, cheerful person, at least as far as the lore and story synopsis for that particular character is concerned, did have an alternate costume in the original called Nightlife, and the costume was basically having her dressed in black leather clothing along with having a rugged hairstyle change. If my little theory is anything to go by, then, characters being de-aged, having their personalities change, their occupations, things of that nature, could line up with this potential theory that this is actually that character as opposed to Alyssa. So this is kind of a wait and see, and a lot of this right now is just me speculating. It could be a very big stretch as far as I'm concerned, but for now, I'm going to assume that this is possibly a redesigned Cindy, although I'm not going to throw out the possibility that this is possibly a redesigned Alyssa or possibly new characters, but we'll get into that in just a moment. Now, the other two characters in the background, we don't really get a good look at them, but you could assume the girl in yellow is probably Yoko because that's the only other female character that was in Outbreak, while the other one, the character that's wearing the blue t-shirt, could be Jim. But if we're going by the whole idea of characters getting de-aged and having personality changes and occupation changes, then there is a possibility that could be Mark as well. Now, with my third reason as to why I don't think this could be File 3, and mainly just because I just talked about characters and potential redesigns, everything that I just talked about and mentioned could be completely irrelevant because what we could be looking at is just completely new characters as opposed to reimagined characters from the original Resident Evil Outbreak. And then obviously there is also the renewed web domain for Resident Evil Outbreak's website, which I've been avoiding this entire video for whatever reason. But that's been updated, and much like the Resident Evil 2 and Onimusha web domains, those were updated shortly before the actual official announcements for Resident Evil 2 Remake and Onimusha Warlords HD Remaster was even announced. So chances are that Outbreak is coming. We are getting a new Outbreak game. The only thing we don't know is if this is a remake, a File 3, or something entirely different just related to the Outbreak spin-off series. Anyway, I think I've talked quite a bit for today, so with that, I think it's time to wrap things up. I'm curious to know what you all think down in the comments below about the images that we've seen so far, also about the web domain being renewed. Do you think that we are getting this Resident Evil Outbreak 1 remake, or is it going to be like a Outbreak reboot or reimagining of sorts? Let me know down in the comments below. Also, if you're new to the channel and you enjoyed today's video, feel free to give it a like, maybe share it around, and consider to subscribe. And with that, I am super tired, and I will see you all in the next one. Oyasumi nasai.